from Kansas State University. This is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And coming up today, K-State's Dan O'Brien looks at this week's rallies in the corn and soybean markets, prompted in large part by ongoing concerns over planting issues. And he'll talk about improvements in U.S. wheat sales, giving the wheat market a boost during Dan's weekly segment on the grain market trends. He'll be followed by K-State's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz, this time discussing potential nitrogen losses in row crop fields because of the moisture extremes. He'll look at the likelihood of a producer needing to compensate for those losses with a supplemental in application. And K-State's Mary Knapp will be in to talk Kansas agricultural weather. She'll tell us if this has in fact been a record month of May for rainfall in the state. Right here on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
This is Agriculture Today, coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. We're glad to have you aboard. Our grain market segment is first up, and we will get responses to this week's frenzied price action on the grain futures with Dan O'Brien joining us. He's a grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension. Dan, it's been a whirlwind of a week in the grain trades, and it appears that the planting difficulties have finally taken root in these markets, especially in corn.
I think as we've gotten into the very last part of May and have seen the planting progress reports struggle so much in so many of the key states, particularly in the eastern corn belt and some places north of us into South Dakota, Wisconsin, parts of Minnesota, and elsewhere, the hard reality of how planted acres are probably going to be down, not just 500,000 or 2 million acres. We're wondering, is it 5, is it 10, is it 15, or is it 20 million acres less for corn? So that's just impossible to ignore in terms of the impacts that type of a production and supply cutback would have upon domestic U.S. corn markets. And along with the acreage cutback, we have cutbacks that we're anticipating. The late plantings are probably going to have a negative impact on yield potential. Again, shortened season, other risks that we'll have to face as we get to the end of this growing season in terms of threat of whatever cold temperatures might come earlier than normal. We just don't know. So we have a really risky situation. And I think the concerns in corn now are moving over into planting concerns for soybeans. They're also behind, although we have a longer time frame before we start really worrying about beans getting put into the ground. But again, soybean plantings normally at this stage, about the last week in May, we're at 66% planted. Well, 29% planted here in 2019. Some key states, Illinois normally 70% planted at 14, just pretty similar to the problems in Illinois that we have with corn. Indiana has 63% normally planted. Last 5-year average 11% this year. And look at Ohio, normally 55% planted, 11% planted this year. So, and there are other states that are having problems with beans. Missouri, normally 53% planted at 12% this year. So, issues upon issues. That one state that it's not in the Eastern Corn Belt that's really stood out in terms of having problems with all these crops has been South Dakota. Again, normally 64% planted on beans. They're at 6% as of May 26th. Now, hopefully, that was the 26th. We've had several days since then. And really, we're to the point to where, yes, we know we've got some higher prices now. Gosh, we're just cheering for some dry weather so farmers can get in the field and get what crops we can, to not end up in a situation where we're cut back so hard on production that we have major problems caused for our usage industries that'll have to absorb higher prices.
The element of prevented planting, which we dwelled upon last week as K-State's Monty Vanderveer joined us, obviously for corn at that point, but that's going to grab a hold of the soybean market pretty quickly here, and it's a very fluid situation on that front, too.
Well, yes. It all depends just how overwhelmingly wet some of the flat fields in the eastern Corn Belt are, as we look at that. By the way, I should add in that Monty has updated and added to that analysis we talked about last week some numbers, some thoughts with regard to how the flat payment, the generalized county-level payments for market facilitation payment approach taken by the USDA on this go-around for MFE payments, how that would likely come into consideration as the person looks at prevented planting choices. So that document just placed up on Ag, so I would encourage people to look at that. And also, not far behind that, we'll have a decision-making spreadsheet that Monty's led the way in terms of developing. So a lot of very timely work coming out from Monty's desk right now. And like I say, couldn't come at a better time to help people make some pretty challenging and important economic decisions for their farm incomes.
Mm-hmm. Well, staying with corn for just a few more moments here, what is the price topside? You put some numbers together with your what-if scenarios to lend at least a little insight there.
Well, it's the time for responsible market economists to get out there and to try to think through where markets could be going. So we put together a corn newsletter. We've got to have that up on Ag Manager here in the last day or so, looking at where we're at currently and where these acreage issues and production issues that we're looking at could take us. It seems that what the USDA put out in the May World Ag Supply Demand Estimates report for their projection for 2019 and 20 has no chance of being anywhere near what the outcome is. Basically because they were planning on a full 93 million acres being planted, and now we're just so far away from that being attainable that really we're looking at scenarios of wondering, well, what happens if we're only 10 million acres short or 15 million acres short? And again, we've got planted now, given where we're at right now, we're about 30 million acres short of getting to 92 million acres. Again, 58% planted as of the 26th. No doubt we've come up some since then where people can get in the field, but we're still planning on, in order to get to the place where we're still able to produce 11.5 to 12.5, 12.75 billion bushels of corn in the U.S., we can really only be short, 10 to 15 million acres. So we're still counting on progress to be made, and given the drive motivation of U.S. farmers, if they can do it, they for sure certainly will. But we're also having to acknowledge now with these late plantings that we're probably not going to hit the USDA's 176 bushels per acre number. We're probably going to be closer to 172, 167, something like that. And that's assuming we have pretty good growing conditions, again, some warmer weather, basically, in these areas, just to get us through June, July, and August, and on into September. So with that, we're still assuming some good things happen. But on the scenarios we've got, there's about a 35% chance of an outcome of about 1.25 billion bushels carry out, stocks to use about 9.3%. And that gives you a price, according to past relationships, cash price about $4.35. But really, the longer these planting issues go, basically if there's a 35% chance of having about a $4.35 price, then everything else with shorter acres, lower yields, less production is higher prices than that. So a personal look at this sheet that we've got here in Ag Manager on both the article and the notes that we're putting out here to support this, you're going to see $5.45 to $6. Mm-hmm. That's where you end up at when you get stocks to use down to 7 and 8%, and you're dancing with and going below a billion bushel of carryout. So when we've seen the run-up that we've seen in corn futures the last day or so, I think there's the growing realization that this is certainly going to be a short crop year, and we just have to figure out what price we get to ration supplies that we do have to try to keep our domestic industries going.
Producers do check out all of those figures that Dan has put together on the agmanager.info website. One final thing, Dan, amidst all the fervor over corn and soybean planting or lack thereof, the wheat trade has sort of been lost in the shuffle. Yesterday, it bounced higher, as you noted, significantly so, and this is on the strength of production questions now.
Well, yes, there was quite a bit of strength in the market. Now, there are reports of ongoing dryness in Canada, in Australia, reports of dry conditions in parts of the Black Sea area. Again, it's too soon to just, quote, camp out on that being the eventual final reality. But still, there are those reports that aren't necessarily showing positive news for production coming from our export competitors. And when you go look at the orders for sales into the next marketing year starting literally June 1st, you have about 123 million bushels of forward purchases off into the next marketing year, a strong start for U.S. wheat export sales that would be projected down the road. And we're even seeing a decent pace of finishing up this old crop marketing year. When you look at hard red winter wheat, the latest numbers that we had out on May the 16th, we've got still forward purchases of that amount to about 105% of what the USDA's projection is of 325 million bushels. So it'll be interesting to see how we reconcile that as we finish up this marketing year and head off into the next. But with everything that's happening in all the markets here, you've got this news that's somewhat quietly coming in, and you're seeing pretty strong purchases on the books for forward sales for U.S. wheat, both overall and also for hard red that we in Kansas and the central and southern plains are growing. With all the planting issues that are affecting corn, soybeans, even possibly grain sorghum, here you have wheat having somewhat quietly really some pretty good days, and we'll see where that market ends up at in the next weeks and months as we go forward.
We'll stand by and see what transpires in the trades next week, and this time next Friday we'll talk about it. Until then, Dan, many thanks.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
This week's Grain Market Analysis and Comment featuring Dan O'Brien, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension. Agriculture Today will be back shortly here on the K-State Radio Network.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
Agriculture Today is back now, and we will return to the topic of nitrogen levels yet in the soil from earlier applications on the part of you producers, and whether our relentless wet weather has taken away from those nitrogen sources, whether there have been losses in the field. Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz is with us once more. He's a crop nutrient specialist with K-State Research and Extension. And this is a question on the minds of any number of producers out there. Those in applications that have already gone on, are they still there, Dorivar?
Yes, Eric, that's a very common question lately. And, of course, we have to think a little bit about the nitrogen cycle if we're trying to estimate how much potential losses we have to this point. Obviously, water is a key factor that drives a lot of the nitrogen loss mechanism that we have. But also we have to keep in mind that we need specifically the nitrate form of nitrogen to have those losses. So that's something that is important to keep in mind as we are looking at each specific field, the history in terms of timing of that nitrogen application, the source of fertilizer that we are using, and the conditions of that soil in particular. Those are going to be key factors affecting that nitrification process, which is basically the conversion from ammonium to nitrate. And again, that nitrate is a form of nitrogen that we can potentially lose from some of the soils with the wet conditions we have in recent weeks.
So you have several factors that could potentially affect that nitrate, that nitrification. Which one of those is standing out as a possible impact here?
Yes, so most of the nitrogen fertilizer sources would be primarily in the ammonium form, except UAN, which will have a little bit of nitrate already. But then anhydrous, urea, all of those will have to go through a process of nitrification, again, converting that ammonium to nitrate. This is a microbial process. So like any microbial process, for that to happen, we need oxygen is one of the main factors in the soil. We also need to have good temperatures. Higher temperature, usually that process is going to be faster. And then there's going to be other factors, things like soil pH and other factors, particular of the soil, that may be affecting the speed of this process. But again, going back to a couple of the key factors, soil oxygen and temperature, those are going to be factors that can make a difference in some fields this year. Again, for example, if you're thinking about completely saturated fields and potentially fields that got anhydrous ammonia this spring and then again saturated conditions, obviously we don't have any oxygen in that soil. That's not good for crops, for sure, but also that process is stopping any nitrification process. So typically the ammonium will tend to remain in that situation because of that lack of oxygen. The other factor of soil temperature is something that is also generally positive in recent weeks. We have lower soil temperatures, which basically minimizing that nitrification process and keeping most of that nitrogen in the ammonium form. So that's a positive thing if we're thinking about fast nitrification process. Typically, as we're getting closer to about 70 degrees of the soil temperature, that's where we start to see fast nitrification processing happening in the soil. So again, that's a positive aspect that we're seeing in terms of the process of nitrification. We also have to keep in mind that some producers may be using some nitrogen additives like nitrification inhibitors. This is a factor that can delay that nitrification process and again, minimizing any potential losses as well. So again, those are things that we need to keep in mind. Obviously, soil types, coarse texture soils, if we have some nitrate in the soil, leaching could be a potential. And again, if we're thinking about potential losses of nitrogen, generally we talk about leaching or denitrification. Those are the main forms of nitrogen losses. But again, these processes are specifically for nitrate. Again, we need to have nitrate in the soil for that process to happen.
You bring up leaching, and this is a time-honored problem, if you will, on our coarser soils out there. Producers are somewhat accustomed to that potential.
Yes, and again, this is where the type of soil will have a huge effect here. We're talking about coarse texture soils, sandy soils. That's where leaching could be a potential. Obviously, we're basically washing all that nitrate from the soil. But then on the other hand, what happens with heavy texture soils, fine texture soils, where maybe we have water standing there? And that's a situation where we can potentially have denitrification. But there's another factor that's going to be very important for denitrification process. This is going to be a process also that is going to be driven by microbial activity. And generally, we need higher soil temperature for that denitrification process to happen. And typically, if we look at some general guidelines, if the soil temperature stays below 60 degrees, that denitrification process tends to be minimum. Now, once we go to about 70, 75 degrees or higher, that's where we start to see denitrification problems. So again, soils, for example, in southeast Kansas, where we have, again, heavy clays, water standing in the field, saturated conditions, we will need to have that much higher temperature for the denitrification process to really start to develop in those kind of situations. For most of our conditions, those are typically going to happen late June, early July, where we start to see those higher soil temperatures and again, potentially more denitrification losses as well.
If the conditions are just so, though, Dorivar, those nitrate-in losses could be substantial if soil temperatures were to climb rapidly.
Yes. Again, if we have most of the nitrogen already in the nitrate form, and again, we are getting to those higher temperature of 75 or higher in the soil, then again, that losses can be substantial. And again, those are situations where we can potentially have significant losses. And again, producers will have to be thinking about options options for maybe supplementing nitrogen later in the season in that kind of scenario. And those are things that we have to keep in mind. All of this, again, it's very difficult to give a good estimate of how much losses we have for specific fields. So we have to evaluate every condition and start basically with what kind of soils we have, what kind of potential losses. Keep in mind, again, that we need to have nitrate in the nitrogen in the nitrate form for any of these nitrogen losses to happen. And again, that will go back to when we apply that nitrogen, fall application versus spring application. Do we use any nitrification inhibitors? What is the source of that nitrogen if we use anhydrous versus urea versus UAN? All of those are going to be factors that are going to be, we have to keep in mind to have a better estimate of potential loss in specific field.
So spring applications, one might be fortunate enough to retain a fair amount of that nitrogen. Fall applications, there may be higher levels of loss, and therefore a supplemental application might be in order?
Yes, and those are the things that we have to keep in mind. Again, those producers that maybe put most of the nitrogen last fall, those are going to be seeing the higher risk of nitrogen losses in recent weeks. And in that kind of scenario, again, we probably need to be thinking about complementing additional nitrogen during the growing season. Again, those producers who did apply nitrogen, especially anhydrous this spring, and again, there were a few situations where we have anhydrous application fairly late this spring. Those usually will tend to be a lot more stable, and we shouldn't have significant losses at this point. Again, what happens in those situations where we have potential losses so far, one thing that I always like to emphasize is that the window for citrus application or complementing that nitrogen to corn is fairly big, and recent studies shows that we can put additional nitrogen all the way basically to tassel and still see a good benefit from that additional nitrogen. And again, we're really talking about complementing here with additional nitrogen, and the corn typically will do fine to this point. We typically will have enough nitrogen, but as the season progresses, basically that corn will tend to run out of nitrogen, especially as we're getting in the reproductive stage. So again, if we're thinking about that critical time, those situations where we potentially have losses, I think considering applications anywhere from 30 to 50 pounds in most cases will typically cover any potential losses that we have and maintain the level of nitrogen for that corn crop.
You point out, though, that it is not easy to pin these losses down. And if one wants to go to this trouble, they could plant some reference strips to get an idea of what they've retained in the way of nitrogen.
That's an excellent point, and this is something that we also recommend some producers, again, because it's very difficult to really have a good estimate for each specific field. Having some reference areas, and this is something that can be done at this point, basically just an area where we're putting additional nitrogen, and that could be easily in the range of 50 to 75 pounds or so, just to have a reference in the field to compare the rest of that field and see if we have any differences, either visual differences, or we can also use sensors to make a comparison of these areas and have a better idea whether or not we are seeing potential losses in some fields. Again, in most situations, we probably won't see any differences at this point. And again, as the corn start to develop and take up more nitrogen, we maybe later in the season we'll see a little bit more of that difference. So this is also very important from that standpoint. Again, as we are seeing yellow corn in the fields, it's not always due to lack of nitrogen in the soil. In many cases will be because we don't have any oxygen in the root system, and that's really the main limiting factor in this case. So that's also something that we need to make sure and differentiate in this case. Is it really a situation where we are running basically out of nitrogen in the soil, or is really a saturated anoxic condition basically causing that problem?
Producers, study the situation extremely carefully before you make any further decisions on N management for those crops and whether or not you do need to go in and supplement in some fashion. There's an article on this in the very latest E-Update newsletter out of K-State's Agronomy Department, agronomy.ksu.edu. As always, Dorivar, thanks for coming over.
Thank you.
That information from Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz, crop nutrient specialist with K-State Research and Extension. We'll return in a moment with more on This Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
You're tuned in to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Welcome back. Now today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN, and in a surprise announcement that could compromise that new U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade deal, President Trump announced late yesterday that he is slapping a 5% tariff on all Mexican imports to pressure that country to do more to crack down on the surge of Central American migrants trying to cross the border. He said the percentage will gradually increase until the illegal immigration problem is remedied, in his words. The president has accused the Mexican government of failing to do enough to crack down on the surge of migrants who've been flowing into the U.S. in search of asylum from countries such as El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. The announcement comes as the administration has been pushing for the passage of the USMCA that would upgrade the North American Free Trade Agreement. But if this situation is not rectified, that 5% figure would increase to 10% on July the 1st, 15% by August the 1st, 20% September the 1st, and a 25% tariff on October the 1st. And the president said that the tariffs would remain permanently at that 25% level unless and until Mexico would substantially stop the illegal inflow of aliens coming in through its territory. Meantime, during a visit to Canada yesterday, Vice President Mike Pence was vowing that the USMCA deal would be passed this year. Mexico and Canada represent the two largest markets for refined corn products out of the U.S., averaging more than $900 billion in shipments a year, among other important markets into that country. And the Mexican government had launched the process of securing the legislative approval for the trade agreement in that country. Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador said that officials delivered that text and the related documents to the Senate in Mexico yesterday afternoon, adding then he was optimistic that the deal would be ratified. That, of course, was before the president announced these new tariffs late yesterday. Tensions between the U.S. and China are ramping up, meantime, as a Chinese Vice Foreign Minister Zhang Huai told reporters in Beijing that the U.S. actions in that trade dispute between the two sides amounted to, quoting him here, naked economic terrorism. China is not in favor of trade sanctions, tariffs, and protectionist measures, Zhang said. Quoting him again, we oppose a trade war, but are not afraid of a trade war. This kind of deliberately provoking trade disputes is economic chauvinism, economic bullying, again in his words. He also warned that the situation could have negative effects on the global economic situation, saying that the trade clash would have a serious negative effect on economic development and recovery, noting that China will make sure, he says, to safeguard our country's sovereignty, security, respect, and security and development interests. In the meantime, Secretary Sonny Perdue of the USDA is urging China to live up to its commitments to buy U.S. soybeans. Here's more from the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
Ag Secretary Sonny Perdue was asked about media reports that China has put purchases of U.S. soybeans on hold.
We're concerned about that. In fact, Secretary Mnuchin asked me for those numbers the other day. These are commitments that President Xi made, Vice Premier Liu He made right in front of the Oval Office desk.
His comments came during a visit to Pennsylvania.
If China can't live up to their commitments like that, then how can we expect them to live up? That's been the problem all along.
He adds that China's decision will influence how it is perceived as a reliable trading partner.
Are we going to be able to do business in a contract way where you commit to buy this many million metric tons? There's already some contracts out there that's not been delivered that are in this summer. But our expectation is they certainly buy the commitment that they made directly to President Trump to his face over the 20 million metric tons.
The 20 million metric tons were what China committed to buy in the current marketing year. This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
On a much lighter note, the 2019 National Festival of Breads is just a few days away here in Manhattan, co-hosted by Kansas Wheat. This event has become a premier event for home bakers and other wheat-based food enthusiasts, and there's something for every member of the family at this festival. Marcia Boswell reports on this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Marcia?
Join bakers from all over the United States on Saturday, June 8th for a fun festival for the entire family. The National Festival of Breads has activities for all ages, including face painting, temporary tattoos, balloon artist, bread samples, pizza in a bag, bread shaping demonstrations, and Ask the Baker sessions, as well as notable featured speakers on the main stage. The festival will be held at the Manhattan Conference Center and Blue Earth Plaza in downtown Manhattan, Kansas, from 8:30 to 4 p.m. Admission to the festival is free with the donation of a non-perishable food item to support the local food pantry. Military appreciation gifts will be provided to the first 200 active or retired military families with military ID. 8 bakers from across the nation will be baking their winning recipes in a Food Network-style baking contest throughout the day. At 3 p.m., they will present their breads to the judges on the main stage in the ballroom. Attendees will have the opportunity to watch the live judging and hear the announcement of the National Festival of Bread's champions in 2 divisions, home bakers and food bloggers, at 4 p.m. There will be baking demonstrations on the main stage from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. Main stage speakers include Chef Tess Stephanie Peterson, Brian Hart Hoffman of Hoffman Media, who is representing Red Star Yeast, Libby Treadway of King Arthur Flour, and Charlene Patton of the Kansas Soybean Commission. Visitors can sign up to win a KitchenAid mixer. The door prize will be drawn at 4 p.m. sharp. You must be present to win. In the hallway, attendees will find exhibitors representing food companies and the agriculture industry. Samples and items for sale will be available. Presenters will be giving bread-shaping demonstrations in the vendor area from 9 a.m. to 2:45 p.m. Learn how to shape bread dough into fun artistic shapes, such as teddy bears, pigs, lambs, spiders, fish, and bunnies. In the Ask the Bakers room, demonstrators will be assisting home bakers and baking educators with ingredients, methods, and equipment questions to build your home baking success and will provide teaching resources and knowledge. Families will have the chance to take home pizza in a bag ingredients and enjoy learning about wheat in the tent in Blue Earth Plaza. There will be games and activities, and kids 12 and under have a chance to win a John Deere toy combine. In addition to bread samples, there will be 4 food trucks outside the hotel to provide lunch options and some breakfast items for all the hungry visitors. The Taste, Vote, and Bid People's Choice Award allows attendees to sample the finalist breads and cast their vote for their favorite bread. The National Festival of Breads will be held Saturday, June 8th at the Manhattan Conference Center in downtown Manhattan, Kansas. For more information, including the full schedule, visit nationalfestivalofbreads.com. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia. And this is Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
Next up for you on Agriculture Today, the very latest out of the Weather Data Library here at K-State, brought to us by Research and Extension climatologist Mary Knapp. Well, Mary, you have the preliminary numbers for the month of May, and the question that looms, was it a record for rainfall in the state?
Yes. For the statewide average with our preliminary numbers, and that could change a little bit, but we're looking at 10.24 inches for the state average.
Which is remarkable, really.
Which is very, very remarkable. It ranks as number 1 of the 125-year record. It also is interesting to note that our January to May total is 16.65 inches, and that also ranks as number one on the record. So we've been talking most of the spring about how wet the winter and spring had been, and May just kind of caps that wet pattern.
How does that compare to what a number of folks use as the benchmark for excessive moisture, 1993?
Well, in 1993, the first 5 months of the year ranked about the 11th wettest compared to the current one. But keep in mind that the bulk of the issues in 93 were in July. And that's where, for example, Manhattan had over 20 inches in the month of July alone. So that's how it compares to 93. We still have a lot of 2019 to get through.
And you have still more numbers here. The state of Kansas, through the CoCoRaHS network, rates high in moisture from a national perspective, you say.
Right. For those that are not familiar, CoCoRaHS is the Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. It is a group of volunteers that is national and even international in scope. All the volunteers use the same standard rain gauge so that it's comparable from one location to the next. And our preliminary numbers from that shows that Kansas holds the dubious honor of having the wettest total for the month of May, and that was in Butler County near Rose Hill, where they had 30.08 inches.
For the month now.
For the month. That is not for the season to date. That is for the month. We also hold the distinction of having the most stations with 20 inches or more. We had 11 of the CoCoRaHS stations that reported more than 20 inches of rainfall. There are only two other states that had any, and that was, not surprisingly, Oklahoma to our south had 8, and Missouri to our east had 2. So, again, very concentrated, wet conditions. If we look at the National Weather Service co-op stations, we can add another 9 locations in Kansas that had a May total of more than 20 inches. So, again, very, very wet.
Leading to flooding concerns throughout many parts of Kansas. The divisional breakdown now for the month, the distinctions from point to point around Kansas. What do the numbers tell us?
Well, sometimes when you hear about the locations that have had that excessive amount, you figure that the balance is tilted across the state. In this case, everyone was wetter than normal. The Northwest Division has been kind of short going through January and particularly in April, but they are our driest, and they are averaged 5.46 inches, which is over 1.5 times their normal for the month. That brought their year-to-date up. It brought their April to May above normal, and it has their September to May also above normal. And again, that was the dry spot. The Western divisions all were running more than 1.5 to almost 2.5 times their normal. Not surprisingly, the wet location was the southeast. They averaged 17.14 inches for the month of May, and that is just a shade under 3 times their normal for May.
Looking ahead then, will we see the occasional break in the rain much as we have had the last 2 or 3 days in Kansas?
There is that possibility. We are actually expected to have a dry spell today and maybe into Saturday before the next round comes up. We do have an increased chance of precipitation Sunday into at least the first part of next week. We talk about the quantitative precip forecast and looking at how much moisture might be squeezed out of these systems. And again, it paints most of the state as wet. The western areas will be on the drier side where they may see 1/2 inch of moisture. But by the time you get into central and eastern Kansas, that amount goes to 1 inch and maybe as much as 2 inches. Not quite as wet as last week where we were looking at 4 to 5 inches, but still that would be above normal, and it would aggravate the already saturated situation that we're facing. The 8 to 14-day outlook is not encouraging. It calls for a slight chance for wetter than normal conditions across the state. Keep in mind that even if it were normal conditions, June is one of our wettest months. The outlook for June favors wetter than normal conditions statewide as well as cooler than normal conditions. And indeed, when we look at the June, July, and August outlook, that pattern continues. There is the ridge down in the southeast, which is creating the heat wave and dry conditions in that area. That means frontal systems coming from the west stall out, and where they stall out, whether it be in Missouri or Kansas, that's where the boundary line for repeated storms is likely to develop.
So we need to shoo that heat ridge.
We need to get that heat ridge to break down and get it pushed out of the southeast to take one of the pins away from that excess moisture. The other problem that we're going to face is because the grounds are saturated throughout the state, that means when we get these clear days, we're likely to have evaporation adding to the moisture in the atmosphere, so that allows for those pop-up thunderstorms that are typical for our summer, and they can dump tremendous amounts because the storms tend not to move much.
Mary, we appreciate the update. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric.
That's Research and Extension climatologist Mary Knapp. Thanks to you for listening in, and please be back with us right here this same time on Monday, won't you? Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.